Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm chatting with Dr. Casey Fiesler. She's an associate professor at the Department of Information Science and Computer Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's a wonderful tech communicator that I met on TikTok at Professor Casey. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for hanging out. So I've got this theory I want to run by you as the framing for our conversation, that AI and chatbots as a proxy are a new kind of user interface that we have not yet figured out. And the reason that it feels weird is that we're kind of anthropomorphizing these text boxes, thinking that we're talking to like a friendly agent, and it's just not a person. But we don't realize that. So this user interface remains rough.
That is an interesting theory. I think I could buy that. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems right now with the way that people are interacting with chatbots and the way that they're being used sort of broadly is that people don't understand what they are. And even recently in some of my social media comments, people have said, oh, well, it's just a search engine or it's just an encyclopedia. And I'm like, no, it is not either of those things.
That is really valid. One of my favorite demos, and the one that I do in almost all of my AI 101 talks, is I do text completion. And I say, it's a beautiful day, let's go to the. And I ask the audience, what's the right answer? And there isn't a right answer. So then if I treat the chatbot as an information retrieval database and it returns beach or park or zoo, people go, oh, well, the right answer is beach. But that's just like playing Family Feud. And just because Steve Harvey says, show me beach, doesn't mean it was correct.
I think Family Feud is actually a really great comparison to use there. One way that I've been describing it is being a sort of bundle of tropes. One of the reasons that I think about it that way is I got in a little bit of an argument once with someone in my social media comments somewhere about whether ChatGPT could write good fan fiction. Because I was saying it writes terrible fan fiction because it's all very like exactly what you would expect. Like, it's cool that you can say, write me a piece of Star Trek fan fiction where Kirk is Dr. House and Spock is Sherlock Holmes. And it can do that. And it's very cool that it can do that. But what you get back is exactly what you like, the most predictable thing, because that's how it works. And so I think that once you get past that novelty of like, oh my gosh, because it's giving you exactly what you want to hear, which is cool that it can do that, but not a particularly interesting fan fiction. It's just a bundle of tropes.
Well, this is great. I love extended analogies that hop around. So remember when we were kids and we would play Mad Libs? And it would be like, okay, give me a color, give me a famous person, give me a piece of clothing. And then you're like 8 years old and you'd go and tell a story. Oh, yeah, this person went to the mall and bought a purple dress and saw, Jimmy Stewart at the mall. Like, that's hilarious because it's such an anachronism, such random things all put together. And you're 8 and you think it's hilarious that like there's a purple dog or whatever. That's just the same thing as temperature on a very large language model, where you go, hey, that's not creative enough. Let's turn the temperature up and get a little more randomization. And maybe Kirk and Spock and Sherlock Holmes are all on the moon now. But it's just like Mad Libs. They're just ridiculous random things. So I feel like we're ascribing creativity to the temperature slider bar when it's in reality not creativity. It's simply randomness.
Yeah, gosh, I have never thought about what I'm about to tell you in the context of large language models yet. But when I was a first year PhD student, I actually spent a year studying improv comedy. Little known fact about me. It was because there was some funding and they were like, that law school thing is weird, but you used to be a cognitive psychologist. Why don't you come work on this project where we studied real professional improv troupes in order to figure out how they improvise to build AI. I coded hours and hours of videos of them saying what they were thinking when they were doing something in an improv game. And we ended up building these little like micro agents that did improvising. And one of the things that was in the code was basically the temperature slider. doing something that was slightly unexpected. Like if they were going to be a character, you would take like the stereotype of that character, but then take one element on it and change that temperature slider. And that was what made it interesting. I never thought about that before, but this was, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how we were thinking about that at the time. But I think it's the same kind of thing. Now people say like, oh, that wasn't interesting enough. Do something that's a little wackier. And suddenly you're like finishing each other's sandwiches instead of finishing each other's sentences.
Which is another example that I use in my talk as well. It's a great example because there's no right answer to "It's a Beautiful Day." Let's go to because it doesn't have enough context. And funny, I did comedy, sports, and stand up for a while, and I'm a big yes and leader at my company. I don't like stop energy, and I'm also a big fan of a comedian named Mike Birbiglia, who does a podcast dedicated to how comedy is developed. It's called Working It Out. And in that, he talks about the very, very subtle line you have to walk between absurdist and true like comedy. And like that temperature scale has got to be perfect. Otherwise, you're just weird. Like that was uncomfortable and not hilarious.
Yeah, totally.
Trying to figure this stuff out, though, is you and I anthropomorphizing, ascribing human behavior to a thing that isn't human, but is still derived on a corpus of human stuff. So it's like, don't think it's a person, but it's doing everything it can to make me feel like it's a person, which brings me back to my original question. Is that the wrong user interface? Does it have to talk to me like it is a computer from Star Trek?
I mean, I think it probably depends on the context, right? For how important it is that you constantly remember that this is not a person. I mean, I feel like it's probably good for people to constantly remember that this is not a person in most contexts. But I suppose one could make arguments about customer service and this kind of thing. And then the question becomes, is it okay if you know? Like, as long as you're reminded that this is a chatbot. And the problem is with customer service chatbots, people aren't being told. And that actually really makes a lot of people upset. People like to know when they're speaking to a human versus not, I think. And I think that's going to be a continuous problem. And so I think that at least you should always know when you're talking to a chatbot versus not. But if it's an issue of just like, what is the user interface? Should it feel more natural when you're talking to it? I think it totally depends on the context.
Yeah. One other thing that I think is interesting for me to think about, and I've been trying to ascribe that, I think that something quietly happened between Alexa, Siri, and Cortana and the modern chatbots is that they appear to have removed gender. We spend a lot of time ordering disembodied women's names around, saying, Alexa, turn off the lights and stuff like that. And, at least, female coded names. And I would always encourage my family and my kids to like say please and thank you. But even now, I can only imagine what all the actual women named Alexa, they must be just really hating life right now.
Oh, there's some kind of movement because someone, a like organization of Alexas kept tweeting at me, like asking me to talk about that. Like there's
have they unionized all the Alexas have gotten together?
There's some kind of organized movement around people. I mean, one of my best friends is named Alexa, and I'm actually really surprised mine did not go off. Which
I actually muted mine before I said it.
But yeah, I mean, and that I actually think that is a very interesting unintended consequence for, all of these poor people with that name. It is interesting that the gender thing sort of went out, but I think that's because ChatGPT wasn't like voice first. And my understanding is when you set up voice on, because you can, talk to ChatGPT, I think the first thing it does is ask you to pick the voice. So there isn't a default.
And I bet you that the voice, this is me guessing, but I think it's a reasonable guess, that it's not using that voice selection on the output as an input into how it behaves. So it's not ascribing gender to its own context, its own prologue.
Have you seen the person on TikTok who is making videos of her talking to Dan, ChatGPT? Have you seen this?
No, I haven't. What are they trying to do?
She's just having this chat with, a version of ChatGPT that's like pretty snarky and inappropriate. And I mean, they have millions of views. And I guess people are trying to make versions of ChatGPT as like a have a discussion with a romantic partner kind of thing. But one of the things I thought was interesting about it is that the interface for talking to ChatGPT, I keep meaning to go back and look, but I think it actually looks exactly like in that episode of Black Mirror where the woman brings back her dead spouse as a robot eventually. But
Oh, yeah,
there's
yeah.
the interim phase where she's talking to it, and the interface to me looks exactly the same. And I thought that was funny because I made a TikTok recently about voice cloning, and people have been fighting in the comments about like the idea of bringing someone back to the dead as a chatbot is okay.
Right. Yeah. See, that's really interesting. I've got 900 shows. I've got over 500 hours of content. The corpus is there. I don't know if my sons would want to have a Hanselman chatbot. They just like let some things die.
One of my colleagues, Judd Brubaker, this is one of his major areas of research. He does work on postmortem data. And this kind of thing, simple versions of this have been around for a long time. There actually was a startup for a while where the tagline was, "When your heart stops beating, you keep tweeting."
Oh no! See, that's
I
the other thing.
I
I've got like,
know.
what do I have now? I've been on Twitter for like 17 years. Like, there's more than enough for it to like, be crap posting for the rest of my life about Beyonce and Neil Patrick Harris.
Yeah, no, simple. And I mean, when that episode of Black Mirror came out and I was talking to my students about it, I was like, we're here. Like that middle technology, like we're basically there, and we're definitely there now. Like with voice cloning and what you just described, like the fact that I haven't already heard about a startup that is doing exactly that right now surprises me a little bit because I'm sure it's in the works.
Okay, so here's an ethics question. You probably remember many years ago, I think my guess is you're maybe a little younger, but when we started cloning, when they cloned Dolly the sheep, it was the biggest news on the world, the whole, it was like number one news story for weeks. But I don't know how this organized, but the world self-organized and said, we're not going to clone people. So a technology appears, a thing happens, and then the world decides to do it or not do it. But then Dolly the sheep being cloned is pre-big tech. Like tech was medium tech at that point. So now we have big tech, big capitalism. I feel like if they clone Dolly, a couple weeks later, we'd have Jurassic Park. Like, you know what I mean? Like things are too big now. Do you think the same thing is happening in large language models? That they're going to make AGI no matter what? Ethics be damned.
That is a really good question. I mean, I have to say, I have been disheartened by the speed at which things have been happening. And I think that speed is because of market competition issues.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a concept that I've been thinking about for a while that kind of came out of my lab, myself and a former graduate student wrote an op-ed about this like 4 years ago, ethical debt as an analog to technical debt. Mm-hmm. And this comes from moving too fast, like not thinking about things ahead of time. And like technical debt is okay. I mean, technical debt wasn't even meant to be a negative thing. Like taking on debt can be good as long as you know that you're taking it on. And so when it's technical debt, like you sort of know, but the problem with ethical debt is like, you might have absolutely no idea what these consequences could be if you don't stop to think about it at all. Right. And I feel like, especially in the early days of ChatGPT, there was just this sense of like, from, other big tech companies, like, we have to pick up the pace. And I saw, quotes from people in the news, like internal documents that were like, we need to pick up the pace. We can think about the consequences later. And, market forces, capitalism.
Yeah, not a fan of market forces.
Yeah.
I saw a really great tweet from Emily Freeman, who is a best-selling DevOps author and a community leader. And she said, stop shipping Gen AI chatbots. We're being flooded with identical tools. Get creative. So many other potential uses. It's funny. I would think about it in the context of like early web design. We started making text boxes. And I remember when text boxes was just like text box and a button. And then we'd have these validators, remember? Where it's like, oh, you have to validate that this is really a social security number. You have to validate that this is really a phone number. We did all this work because we were told in the early days of the web, don't trust user input. And here we are again with a giant text box and a button. And we're not supposed to trust user input. And the user input could make my coffee ordering chatbot like write a Python script to take over the world. And that's clearly ethical debt that no one is thinking about.
Yeah, things keep happening that like the amount of how did you not know this could happen just like I mean
What's
even
the
the recent one with like the New York City chatbot where they have a chatbot like answering questions for small businesses and some journalists from the markup tested it and it turns out it's telling people to do illegal things,
Mhm.
which of course it is. Or like, there was the eating disorder helpline. Their workers tried to unionize, and so they had a chatbot answering people instead. And within like 5 days, it was gone.
Yeah, and then was that Air Canada chatbots can be convinced to give people upgrades?
Yep. And the car dealership, like selling someone a car for $1 because they just like integrated ChatGPT into their website without it.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these things happen because whatever IT person for the car dealership decided to do that, like, may not have known a lot about chatbots. But then there's other examples where you should have known that this kind of thing could happen. And it's hard to tell whether it really is not thinking about it at all or how difficult it is for people to imagine these things, which
Yeah.
sometimes surprises me a little bit. I mean, I guess this is I guess I do this all day, right? Like
There's this really great tweet that I'm reminded of. It was a political tweet from 2015, but I think it has AI implications now. And the tweet was, "I never thought the leopards would eat my face," sobs the woman who voted for the leopards eating people's faces party. And now, like, leopards ate my face is like become like the clarion call of like, I didn't think it would happen to me. And now here we are, maybe getting ethical debt around AI.
I highly recommend the Leopards Ate My Face subreddit.
That's a good
for many examples. I mean, if you want to like weep.
Trying to think about these things, though, when you are doing this kind of public scholarship, like we're here complaining, but is there a solution? Is there an answer? And is the answer just slow down? Because I'm doing talks, I'm doing public education on AI, you're doing a public education on AI. But simply standing in front of like the avalanche, the classic Babylon 5 quote, "The avalanche has begun, it's too late for the pebbles to vote." You and I are the pebbles in this context. And I'm out there selling AI because I'm excited about aspects of it, but I'm not excited about other aspects of it. So I'm also complicit.
I mean, I guess it depends on who the audience is, right? So for me, I'm speaking to the general public who may not understand enough about AI to be critical of it or to know how it's appropriate to use it and how it's not. That's what I'm trying to do. I don't have any delusions that my TikToks are changing anyone at OpenAI's mind about anything.
You don't think you've saved anyone with your TikTok?
I don't think I've saved anyone with my TikTok. I mean, I'm in an interesting position because I am a researcher.
Mm-hmm.
I have written many papers about technology ethics and a little bit about AI and ethics. So that's not really like my main thing. I'm more a communicator around that. And I'm trying to help people understand these things so they can be more critical. At the very beginning of ChatGPT, when I was first thinking about it, I went back and reread the paper that Joseph Weizenbaum published about ELIZA from like 1966 or whatever. And a really interesting thing from that paper is that, I mean, the whole thing, like ELIZA, the chatbot, for folks who might not be as familiar with that, the psychoanalyst, turns out it's very easy to create a procedural, like Mad Lib style psychoanalyst, I'm sad about my mother today. Oh, tell me about your mother. But he seemed sort of surprised and disturbed when his secretary, like even knowing that it wasn't real, was very like sort of taken in by it. And he says in this paper, technology can seem like magic. It can fool even the most experienced observer. But as soon as you can explain it in ways that someone can properly comprehend it, then that magic crumbles away. And I think that's totally true for a lot of kinds of technology. And the problem is it is very hard to make the magic of generative AI crumble away. Because even when we tell people like, oh, it's basically autocomplete, that's not really sufficient understanding for what it is. And it's very hard to describe, especially in a short amount of time, what is actually happening here when it seems so magical.
Yeah, the elevator speech to explain it to non-technical parent is the elevator ride is too short to explain it. So when non-technical parent calls and is like, "Do I want this? Is the AI?" It's like, "Well, it kind of depends. Watch this 20-minute tech talk or this 90-minute lecture, and then come back with questions." And that's the wide-reaching ramifications of all of this moving so fast, and then applied to all of the other pressures post-COVID and politics, is adding up to a lot of stress. And some people think that this is the way out of our problems. And also, very large language models being conflated as artificial general intelligence is another huge problem.
Yeah, totally. That and like there is a particular genre of pedantic social media comment that I've been getting lately, which is this is not AI. Stop using the word AI. Do you get that or is it just me?
I have not gotten that, although I have said that I feel like AI has an interesting branding situation where it's fun to say AI and ChatGPT has good mouth feel, but ML and data science doesn't.
Well, that is very true. There's an interesting spectrum here. There's the people who think that we are like 5 days away from GAI or
5 minutes
sentience.
away?
5 minutes away from, yeah, there are tons of people who are like, we're practically there, right? So there's like those folks. And then there's the folks who are like, this is all literally just linear regression. I don't see why anyone's getting so worked up about it.
Well, then you have to go and explain linear regression to random people. Like it gets complicated fast. And it's hard for me to I want to explain this stuff to folks in a way that is inclusive. Like as an educator, I think we all want people to like feel powerful and not afraid. And that's a reasonable thing to want.
Totally. I mean, and one of the problems with the amount of hype around Gen AI is like the hype is either, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing ever. This is going to change everything tomorrow. Nothing is going to be the same. Like this is the most amazing tech. And then there's the world's going to be over next year. It's going to destroy humanity like right away. And sometimes it's the same people. So either way, the hype is like making the technology seem much more powerful than I think it actually is, especially right now.
Well, yeah, plus the mechanical Turk problem. I was recently giving a talk to some people in Turkey and used the term mechanical Turk and then explained it to them that the idea that a lot of the AI that you're seeing is not necessarily AI, it may be ghost workers.
Right. It's funny too, because that is also an issue of not understanding how these systems work. Okay, so even for a chatbot, like I explained something about ghost work recently, and someone said, "Are you saying that like there's some dude that's like very quickly typing the answer when I asked ChatGPT something?" And I was like, no, that's not what I'm saying. However, it is still very common for people to forget the huge amounts of human input that went into creating the system in terms of data labeling and supervised learning and this kind of thing. And when we forget the humans that are part of the system, it A, seems more magic, and B, it can obscure sources of bias and that sort of thing. I mean, and this is a huge issue. Like all of this only works because of data labeling, and whether that label data is coming from captioned images online or whether it's humans that are looking at things and labeling them, or whether it's Amazon mechanical Turkers who also are humans. Sorry, that was a weird way to put that.
Or unpaid YouTubers, as we just learned, who had their transcripts, including my own and my blog. And, actually, do you know that someone actually accused this podcast of being AI generated because they couldn't conceive of 900 episodes over 18 years being actual
Oh, that's
work.
kind of funny.
Yeah, this is a real thing.
That's funny.
They tried to get it delisted.
Interestingly, a lot of my research over the past 8 years has been around research ethics for public data, which, until recently was largely things like machine learning researchers, sucking up everything from a subreddit to build a classifier about whether someone's depressed, like that sort of thing, or social scientists studying people's tweets. And a lot of that work has been around how people react to this. And, a lot of times the reaction is, why would scientists be reading my tweets? That's weird. But I feel like I've seen a lot of the same kinds of patterns in people's reactions to thinking about their inclusion in training data, and that it feels extractive.
It does. I've stopped blogging because I'm tired, but also because I'm not I don't know if I want to feed the giant maw that is AI. But that means then, how is it ever going to get smarter if the corpus doesn't get smarter? And we've already seen in the last year and a half, Google's search results have turned into garbage because everything is AI-generated splogs.
Yep. So I think there's this like sort of fundamental question here, which is, a lot of people will tell you that the only solution is for this technology to not like that the technology itself is fundamentally unethical because the only way that it exists is it was created, on the backs of people without their consent. You hear this a lot from artists, and I think that is a very valid argument. Now, do I think there is any possibility that the genie is out of the bottle? Yeah. It's hard to imagine this technology not being used at all for this reason, except for the extent that copyright things start to happen. I personally think this is unlikely, but if copyright cases all went like wildly not on the side of the tech companies and all training data is copyright infringement and shut it all down, what's probably going to happen is that we will get a bunch of AI models that are not as good.
Yeah, or a bunch of open source ones that are put on torrents that are trained on regular data anyway and can't be stopped.
And I think people will reasonably disagree about whether that is a better solution or not, right? Like, even folks in the AI ethics community disagree vastly about many of these things. I don't think that's surprising. And I think there are a lot of reasonable arguments on different sides of all of this. I mostly just want us to get to a place where if this technology is going to exist, which it almost certainly is at this point, what are the ways that it can be developed and deployed as responsibly as possible? And one of the problems is that you can't get to that place with the speed at which things are moving and without having some kind of agreement on priorities. And that's why people are like clamoring for regulation, is because there is an assumption tech companies are not going to do this on their own.
Some kind of a GDPR for AI.
Yeah. And, we have the AI Act in the EU now, and I do think that could have some impacts. I think it's probably likely to not have the kinds of widespread impact that people think that it will, in part because of some of the difficulty of implementation of some pieces of it. But there are some things that I think, the things that are most GDPR-like, I actually think are the things that are more likely to happen. Like requiring information about training data and that sort of thing, like provenance. Things that are very sort of rote. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I do think those things could be helpful. Like, traceability of data behind things is a hard problem right now.
We've reached the end of our podcast and we've asked a lot of good questions, answered a few. I want to point folks to a recent research article that you were a part of called Teaching Ethics in Computing, where you went through 40 years of published research on teaching ethics in higher education. And you published that as part of the ACM. I could see it up there in their recent January publication along with some of your colleagues. And that just gives you a taste of the work that you've done. And of course, folks can check you out at your website at caseyfiesler.com, and I'll link to you in the show notes. And you've got links to your TikTok and your socials there as well.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for spending time with me today. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.